my beautiful grief growers, and welcome to another Monday Facebook Live video. This week we're going to be talking about a concept called mortality awareness, or death focus, or being really focused on or attentive to death after somebody you love dies. So we all know, kind of in the grand scheme of things, that we're all going to die. It's a fact of life that kind of is issued out into the world. As I've talked about in previous podcast episodes, it's something that appears a lot in children's movies, is this concept of death or being killed. Even Mother Nature reminds us every single year that things die off, things grow weaker, and things eventually will fall into the ground, fade away, and then renew into something different. So this whole cycles of life, the concept of death is very ever present in our society. For as much as we don't talk about it, it's always there. But a lot of times when we lose people we love, we lose loved ones, watching another human being die or being around for the experience of somebody else's death can really kind of open our eyes to the concept of, oh my gosh, that's going to happen to me too. It no longer becomes this distant, ungraspable, far off, intangible, kind of floating abstract idea. It becomes a real reality that can and will one day affect you and may play out in a same or similar fashion to the loved one that you just recently lost. So this idea to do a podcast episode on mortality awareness kind of came into my brain one day when I was dusting my bookshelf, which is actually on the opposite side of this camera. I'm looking at it right now. I was dusting my bookshelf and I was making tea, hot water for tea, and I was getting ready to sit down here on my laptop and start writing for the show. And this sudden thought just came into my brain, as I was dusting these books, I was like, oh, someday I'm going to die, and somebody else is going to have to go through these books. There will be a day that is the last day that I come into contact with these personal possessions. There will be a day that what we did with Mom's stuff, her books, her journals, what she left on the bookshelf after she died, there will come a day when somebody will be doing that with my stuff. And I just had this moment of whoa, one day I won't be here anymore and somebody will have to hold these things in their hands and decide what to do with them. And it wasn't a fear, really. I wasn't afraid for my life. I wasn't really upset about it. I wasn't shocked by it, but it was just this really present thought that was in the front of my brain, is oh, someday I'm going to die too. And somebody else will have to go through my stuff, just like we did with Mom's. And it just came right through my brain, and I was really just wow. And what's really interesting about this is I never used to have thoughts like this before my mom died. And maybe it's because I lost my mom in my 20s, and there's that whole I'm invincible period where people from teenage years to early 30s are I'm invincible, life can't get me, nothing bad can ever happen. But that all kind of came crashing down when my mom died, and I was oh my god, I'm gonna die too one day, and it's going to look like this or look something like this, and it's going to have this effect, and just having these consequences radiate out from a death is something that really struck me. And now I think a lot about me dying, the concept of me dying, and just this concept of I'm going to die someday. And it turns out what's really cool about this concept is I'm definitely not alone in this. And that's the whole point of the podcast, yes, but also for this Facebook Live video, is that you're not alone if death is coming through your brain a lot more after a loved one has died. If you're thinking about your own death, if you're thinking about writing a will, if you're thinking about how you would like to die and the process of how you would like to go, totally not abnormal, totally normal after you lose a loved one. So much so that I went hunting on the internet for other people's stories of thinking about death after a loved one has died, and one of my favorites is from What's Your Grief, and I'm reading this here. One of the authors has always been a purpose of life type thinker, even from the time that she was a little girl, but especially after some people close to her died, she started talking about death a lot more and vocalizing it, and what she was met with was, oh my god, you're so morbid. Because while we see death a lot in our culture, we don't really talk about it, and people are oh my god, you're thinking about the end of your life. A, are you okay? And B, that's so morbid. The Atlantic actually wrote a piece on this that I really enjoyed reading, which is pretty much what's the point of life if we're all going to die. It was very much an article about thinking about our mortality and the legacy we leave on this earth. And there was a really cool line in there that said the only cure to death is immortality. And because we're human, that's something that's impossible to us. So especially after loved ones close to us die, or we watch someone we love die, there's this kind of grasping for and this questioning of, how can I leave a legacy? What is my purpose? What is going to make me continue on? And what will continue on after I am gone? So what will continue on beyond me after I've gone? So a lot of people quit jobs, delve into passion projects, spend more time with friends and family, develop hobbies or start curating hobbies that they didn't have before after a loved one has died. So I thought that article was really interesting because it focused a lot more on less the discussion of death, but talking more about leaving a legacy, this desire to find the purpose and meaning of life. The last kind of place I looked was just these various forums of message boards around the internet, things like that, and a lot of them were wrestling with religion and its relationship to losing a loved one and thinking about death after losing a loved one. A lot of people were, Jesus is my rock, I know where I'm going after I die, and a lot of people kind of headbutted against that. They were like, I don't know where I'm going when I die. I'm not sure that my dad is in heaven. I'm not sure that they will see the afterlife that they always envisioned for themselves. And there's kind of this grasping towards and this pulling away from religion that people previously knew. So it's really fascinating and really kind of cool to see these conversations about death happening after someone you love has died. Let's see, I've got Eline coming in here saying, I love to listen to your podcast when walking the dog, love the last one. Feeling that fear about mortality is a really weird thing. It is kind of a weird thing, but it happens to all of us after we watch someone we love die. I've always been very afraid of dying and death, and I think, let's see, I can't read the rest of the comment because I'm on my phone doing this Facebook Live here, but I'm so excited to read this after I get off the live today and kind of respond to that. It is normal to have that fear of death and fear of dying, and especially when it hits so close to home, we're just like, holy shit, holy crap, this is something that's going to happen to me too. And it's just really wild. So kind of some overarching patterns that I noticed in my research for this segment on the podcast is talking about death more. Just having death on the brain, talking about how you want to die, how you want things to go, who you want possessions to go to. Sometimes there's a scrambling to make up a will or start designating who's going to get what or dividing land. There's a generalized fear of death. There may be fear of going to sleep at night, going to the same places that your loved one was before they died, maybe developing the same conditions that they had for fear of eventually dying, especially if you have dependents in your life, so especially if you have children or especially if you're around the same age as the person who died. So I'm a 20-something right now. If I lost one of my friends in a car accident and they were also a 20-something, I would be very afraid for my life all of a sudden, because if it can happen to them, it can happen to me. Same thing with families who have cancer or heart disease or things running in them, and they're like in their 50s or 60s. When children grow into their 50s and 60s, they're like, I'm really close to that age. When my loved one died, this is going to happen to me too. So kind of a more close to home fear of death. Another thing that I've noticed happens when people start thinking about their own mortality is they start to appreciate time, loved ones, and day-to-day mundanity more. So just the concept of being alive and being in the everyday. And so a lot of people become more grateful after they watch someone die. And that this can kind of depend on your experience, because there is that reeling of the initial shock and loss and overwhelm of grief, but then there's also like, oh my God, they died and are no longer here. I get this gift of being alive and like experiencing all of this when they no longer can. So there's like an increased treasuring sometimes of time, loved ones, or the day-to-day mundanity. Like, I get to do the laundry today, I get to see these flowers today, I get to pet my cat today, things like that. Again, questioning religion is a big thing that comes up, either questioning religion or clinging really, really hard to it. It kind of develops in extremes here. Death, witnessing a death, being around a death can cause us to really grapple with how we feel about religion, what we've been taught about the afterlife, whether or not we're going to continue to agree with what our family and our roots kind of agree with, or if we're going to branch out to something different, or if something about the death has changed our lives, maybe a near-death experience or some kind of other spiritual connection that you can't explain might cause you to explore more. And then lastly, just a pondering of the meaning of life, the purpose of life, your passions, why you're here, what kind of imprint or legacy you want to leave on the world. I read a cool quote the other day, and I'm not going to recall it correctly here, but it's something along the lines of, I can't change the world, but I can leave my handprints all over it. And I think that was just a really cool way to kind of sum this up, because we cannot last forever. There is no such thing for us as humans as immortality, but we can leave these ideas, these more abstract thoughts, and even like foundations, pieces of art, pieces of music that can last for an eternity. So there might be more of a seeking out of, how can I create something like this? I will put in a disclaimer, and I said this on the podcast as well for a couple of you who we're listening this week that there is a psychological condition known as death anxiety. And this is a condition where the fear of death, the fear of dying, the fear of not being here anymore, the fear of having or developing the same conditions that caused loved ones to die really takes over and overwhelms your life to the point where you're not sleeping, you're not eating, or you're sleeping too much, or you're eating too much, or not. You're kind of hindered in your day-to-day in terms of anxiety and in terms of depression, and it really stops you from being here and being alive and living your life here on the earth. And if that's the case for you, if death is all you can think about after someone you love dies, it's not just a thing that comes in and comes out and it's kind of like, oh, that's kind of new, it's there all the time, that's a case where I would definitely tell you to seek therapeutic help, counseling, group support, because this is not something that's unheard of. Counselors, therapists, they will know what this is. They will see and understand death anxiety and can help you walk through that. But if it's hindering your life in some way, you really want to get that taken care of and get that looked at. And again, you're not crazy for thinking about death, because it does hit so close to home and it can really have this huge impact on us. But if it is hindering your day-to-day, go ahead and see someone else and get that looked at, get that talked about, get that out there in the open so you can continue to live while you are still here on the earth. I will say 3 things kind of about death talk, mortality awareness that are really important to kind of keep in mind as these thoughts are kind of processing through your brain. The first one is to talk to others about death, about loss, about how you'd like to go. It's a really, for me, and maybe it's because I work with grief, but for me it's a really fun conversation starter. It's like, how do you want to die? How would you like to picture your death? I read a really beautiful account in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on grief and grieving about how she died, how she requested to die. And not only was it at home, because there's a big conversation happening right now about would you rather die in a hospital or die at home, and people get to choose, or the discussion about whether or not to be taken off life support. These are all really important conversations to have. But there's also these elements of, would you like friends and family to come and visit? Would you like to be surrounded by flowers? Would you like your bed to have a specific blanket on it? Would you like certain music to be playing? Would you like to invite spiritual healers into the house? These small, detailed elements, and I'm getting chills here, of how we would like to make this transition from one plane of existence to the next. And whatever you believe about spirituality or the afterlife, that's up to you. But death is a transition. How would you like to make that transition for yourself, ideally? And this comes up on another podcast, but just telling people how you would like to die is a really cool and powerful way to have just a smidgen of control over these last moments of your life, and to let your loved ones know how you feel about death, how you want it to go, what are your wishes before something happens, so that when it does happen, they're like, okay, here's what we're rallying, here's what we're going to make happen, because I know that this is what they wanted. Second thing to remember as you're talking about death, or the mortality awareness is coming in and out of your space, is don't do anything too quickly. So sometimes when we watch people we love die, there's this instant whoop reaction to be like, I need to plan a will. I need to get everything in order. I need to sell the house. I need to quit my job. I need to blah, 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 to get everything in order for when I'm going to die. And there's just this moment, especially if emotions are running high, if you're having drama with your family, if you're having, estate battles, things like that, especially with a death, it's really important to say things like, okay, I need to take a breath. I need to have some sort of deadline, some sort of kind of date on the calendar to approach this later, but don't make a will, don't sell the house, don't quit your job in a really hasty fashion because of the death, because of something that happened. There's this temptation to be like, oh my gosh, they died, I'm going to die too, so I need to do all these things to kind of compensate for the fact that I'm going to die one day as well. And it's really, really tricky. So just taking the space to be like, okay, they just died. I'm not planning on dying anytime soon, but the will doesn't need to be made today. I need to focus on my family today. I need to focus on funeral arrangements today. I need to focus on work today, or my kids today, or whatever you need to focus on in that moment. And things like wills, selling the house, quitting your job, these are things that can wait a little bit for that grief to kind of set in, for you to kind of recalibrate after you've lost someone. So these hasty decisions related to, oh my God, I'm going to die, they can wait. The last thing I want to mention before I go off today, and this is probably my favorite and least favorite part about mortality awareness after someone you love dies, is that we will never figure all of this out. A lot of people, especially in cases of death anxiety where this really kind of rules their life, you see people, sitting up at night wondering what's going to happen when they die. They're kind of focused on, if I could figure all this out, if I could control it, if I could make everything fit into these little boxes. We have no idea how we're going to die. We could die. I could die right now. I could have some sort of episode in this chair as you're watching this Facebook Live, and I could not be here anymore. And I've done what I can to tell people what I want to happen, but that's it. At some level, death is ultimately out of our control. We could get hit by a car. We could come down with a 24-hour disease, and we could get something in another country. We could, get hit by a bus. It happens everywhere, and it's this pervasive thing of we can plan and plan and plan and plan and plan and try and make things go as succinctly and as well and with as much flow as we possibly can, and you're going to get the chest of drawers, and you're going to get the necklace, and you're going to get this, and I want to be buried, not cremated, all these other things, and you can put as much in line as you can possibly think of, and yet there are still things about death that you won't understand and won't know, A, until it's happening to you, and B, until after it's already happened, and in that case you'll be dead. So you can't control for that. You can only put your hands on so much of your own death. You can only put your spirit and your energy into so much of your death before you have to say, okay, that's as much as I can do. And I need to step back and continue to live my life. And I've told everybody as much as I can. And now whatever happens, I just have to let it happen. And that's another kind of fact of life that comes in, that life, death, life, that control, lack of control thing that comes in. And I think it's just a really important point to keep in mind as well. I'm going to scroll up and read a couple more comments here. This is such an important conversation to have. This is from Rachel. I have become so death obsessed. It's all I think about, want to read about, talk about, and listen to. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Shelby, for making it okay to talk about. And it is okay to talk about. The shitty thing about, I don't just want to say living in America, but living in other countries as well, is people think that if you're talking about death, there's something wrong. You're going to kill yourself, or you're going to cut them out of the will, or you got news of a diagnosis and you're not telling them. Like, it's all these, like, taboo things in talking about death, but in talking about death, we're talking about how we want to be remembered. We're talking about life, and we're talking about the things that ultimately, for lack of a less dramatic word, the things that ultimately destroy us, the things that take us down, the things that are going to change not only our lives, but the people's lives around us forever. There's this like ripple effect when a death happens. And we don't do enough of acknowledging that, which is really cool. So thank you, Rachel, for that comment, and thank you, Elaine. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, for being here on the live with me today. This is really cool to have all of you here. I know we're all in different time zones, so this is really like wicked cool. But yeah, that's all I have for you today. And just opening up this conversation of it is okay to talk about death. How do you want to go? How do you want to divide up your worldly possessions? Do you even want to have possessions after you die? What's your ideal? Like, I always told my mom after I saw Mary Poppins for the first time, I said, Mom, I want to die like that guy. And she's like, oh my God, what do you mean? And I said, that guy died because he was laughing so hard. He had a heart attack. He floated up to the ceiling and he died the next day. And I'm like, what a great way to go. And so from the time I was a little kid, I said, I always wanted to die laughing. And so that's my ideal. I can tell people that's my ideal, but whatever happens, happens. But just being able to open up this conversation, especially after someone you love has died, write about it, talk about it, make video diaries of it, make a podcast about it. But it's definitely something like, how do you want to go? What happens physically in the body? There's so many questions about death that are so unanswered. So I really encourage you. I put the link in the comments. I don't know if they're below or above, but in the description for this. And there's a ton more in the podcast this week. And then there's also a really cool interview with Joshua Black of Grief Dreams, who analyzes people's grief dreams, but is also studying them for his master's and his PhD. So he's like one of the leading researchers on grief dreams. So there's a great story and great interviews there about the dream that changed his life. But yeah, mortality awareness, it's a real thing that happens. And if it's happening to you, you are absolutely not crazy, totally normal. And it is another one of these pieces of grief that's kind of unexpected. But once we get there and we see that others are there too, it's not so bad. So thank you so much for joining me today. I will see you all next Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time.